Masechet Avoda Zara, Daf Nun Dalid, Tana, Ne'avad, Shelo Asur, V'shel Chavero Mutar. If a live animal is worshipped, what is the status of that animal? It depends. If it belongs to the worshipper himself, then the animal is prohibited. And a live animal does not become prohibited for regular use, even if it's worshipped. Rather, we're talking about that it becomes prohibited to use as a sacrifice. So if I bow down to my own cow, then that cow is prohibited to use as a sacrifice. However, if the cow belongs to my friend, then the cow is permitted, because the principle is one person cannot make prohibited the cow that belongs, or any property that belongs to someone else. He has no right to do that. That is Baraita number 1. Urminhi, but this seems to be contradicted by a second Baraita. Ezehu ne'evad, what is called something that is worshipped and therefore becomes prohibited? Kol she'ovdim oto, ben b'shogeg, ben b'mezid, ben be'ones, ben b'rason. Anything that someone serves, whether they do so by mistake or on purpose, whether they do so under duress or willingly. That's the Baraita. Now, this case under duress, what are the circumstances? Hai ones hechidame lav kegon de'anas behemat chavero v'ishtachavala. Is it not talking about where someone steals the animal belonging to someone else and then bows down to it? In that case, he is worshipping an animal that does not belong to him, and yet it becomes prohibited, because it says Ezeu ne'avad. These things are considered idolatry and therefore prohibited. If it's a live animal, then it would be prohibited to use as a sacrifice. So now we have a contradiction. The first Baraita says if someone worships someone else's animal, it's permitted to use, and the second Baraita says it's forbidden. Amar Rami bar Chama la kegon shanasuhu goyim v'ishtachava lebemto dideh. Rami bar Chama says, no, I can explain the second Braita. The case of onus is not what you said over here, that it's talking about someone who steals someone else's cow and bows down to it and becomes prohibited. No, that's not the case. Rather, that's that non-Jews come and force a Jew to bow down to his own animal. And so that's honest, it's under duress, but he's bowing down to his own animal, so that's why it makes sense, and that way he reconciles the two. But I thought one's own animal, if he bows down to it, yes, becomes prohibited to use as a sacrifice. That's Rami bar Chama's answer. We're going to see another answer later. Matkif la Rabbi Zera. Ones rachamana petare. Dichtib b'la na'ara lo ta'aseh davar. Rabbi Zera challenges Rami bar Chama because, in general, if someone does something, a sin, under duress, Hashem says he is not liable. And how do we know that someone's not liable for a sin under duress? From the case of a rape of a betrothed woman. If a man rapes such a woman, so he gets the death penalty for adultery because this young woman is betrothed to someone else. What about her? If it was consensual, then she would get the death penalty also. But if it's rape against her will, under duress, then the Torah says to the young girl, do not do anything. It's the same as being a victim of a murder. You don't blame a victim of a murder for being murdered. And so the same thing here. Therefore, we can apply this rule also across the board, including to idolatry. Since this person was forced to worship idolatry, he gets no punishment. And not only does he get no punishment, there also should be no penalty for his cow. His cow, because the cow was worshipped, is true, but it was under duress, the cow should be permitted. And therefore, Rabbi Zera challenges Rami bar Chama's case in such if it was under duress, the cow should be permitted, not prohibited as the second Baraita says. Ela Amar Rava. Rava is going to come and support Rami bar Chama. Rami bar Chama and Rava were often challenged each other vehemently. But here, Rava is coming to the support of Rami bar Chama. Hakol hayu bichlal lo ta'ovdem. Uchshe parat lecha katuv v'chai behem v'lo shemut behem yasa ones. Rava says, let me explain to you the development of this law. If you had only the 10 Commandments in Shemot, where it says, do not worship idols, so then I would say that includes everything, all cases of idolatry, even under duress. But then later on in Vayikra, It says one should live by the laws of the Torah and not die because of them. And therefore, if someone is telling you, you better worship this cow or die, so then you should worship the cow and not die, and you would be patur. So that's the second level. But we're not over yet. And then later on in Vayikra, it says one shall not profane Hashem's name, and by bowing down to an idol, that would be profaning Hashem's name. So that pasuk comes to say, afilu be'ones, even under duress, even at the threat of your life, do not worship idolatry. Hakesad. So now we have two pesukim that seem to contradict each other. B'chai Bahem says, live and worship the idolatry. Lo techalalu, don't make a chilul Hashem, says, better to die. So which one is it? And the answer is ha-b'sin'ah, ha-b'faresya. Depends on the case. If one is in private and some thugs come and say, worship this idol or die, then better to worship it. It's in sin'ah, so therefore it will not cause a chilul Hashem. So that's where we apply b'chai behem, live. But if it's in public, where everybody will see this, then that will create a chilul Hashem, and therefore better to die rather than worship idolatry. Therefore, when we go back here, it could in fact be a case of ones, as Rami Bar Chama said, and it's in public. And when it's in public, then one does violate this prohibition, and the animal would in fact be prohibited to use, even though it's under duress. So that's Rami Bar Chama must be talking about a case where he's forced under duress, but it's in public. Amru le Rabbanan le Rava. Tanya de Messiah alach. The rabbi said to Rava, we have a baraita that seems to support your opinion, that in private you should worship the idolatry, but in public it's prohibited. B'musiot shel goyim b'shat hashemad, af al pi hashemad batel, otan b'musiot lo batlu. A baraita teaches that the platforms that the non-Jews use for idolatry, they put the idol on these platforms, when they are used during a time of persecution, where the idolaters come and tell the Jews, you better bow down to this idol that's on this platform or else die. Even though the persecution has ended, those platforms remain prohibited. The Avoda Zara status is not revoked. So that means that even though it's under duress, nevertheless, the fact that the Jews were forced to bow down to it is considered idolatry, because they should have given their lives rather than bow down to these idols. And the fact that they did bow down to the idols makes the idol and the platform prohibited and cannot be revoked, because it was served as idolatry. And so that proves that there are circumstances, and this would be in public, when a Jew has to give up his life. So isn't that a good support for Rava? Amar lehu imi shumha la tesayan. Emar Israel mishumad hava uflach la berason. And the Rava said to the rabbis, no, this is not necessarily a proof, because it's possible that among all the Jews, most of the Jews were forced and didn't want to do idolatry, but they just wanted to save their lives. But it's possible that there is an apostate Jew among them who said, oh, you know what? I actually like idolatry, and didn't do it by force, but did it willingly. So even if there's one Jew in the whole crowd that worshipped the idol willingly, that would make the idol and the platform prohibited. And so that's why the platforms are prohibited. But really, it could be that the other Jews that did it under duress would be okay, would be patur, and so wouldn't become prohibited because of them, but because of this one possible Jew. Rav Asher Amar la temar emar ela vadai Yisrael mishumad ava uflach la berason. Rav Asher furthers this statement that Rava counters and says, don't say maybe there's a Jew. For sure, there's going to be one Jew who's an apostate who worshipped it willingly. If you have a big group of people, most of the Jews are going to go worship because they're afraid of their lives. But guaranteed there's going to be one person, if that's the situation, and there's idolatry is so widespread and people are forcing, there's going to be someone who says, you know what, I really like idolatry, and going to be doing it willingly, and therefore for sure we can assume that, and that's why the platform is prohibited, not because of the Jews that did it under duress. And therefore, that baraita is not a proof, it's not a disproof against Rava, but it's also not a proof. Chizkiya Amar. And now we have another answer to the question we had against these two baraitot. Chizkiya here actually is going to go back to the original assumption that we had during the question. Now remember here that the first baraita said, if you worship someone else's cow, the cow is permitted. And the second one said, if it's by force, under duress, it's still prohibited. And by force, under duress, we said, doesn't that mean that you stole someone else's cow and bow down to it? So that would make it prohibited, but it's someone else's cow. So how could that be? That was the question that we had before. And so now Chizkiah has a second answer. We're talking about a case not where the thief who stole the cow just bowed down to it. If he would just bow down to someone else's cow, it would not make it prohibited. But rather, it's talking about a case where he poured a libation of wine on the horns of the animal. Just like a mizbech, an altar, has corners called horns, and you pour the libation on that. So he takes this whole cow and he's treating it kind of like a mizbeach and putting the wine on the horns of it. And so, according to Chizkiah, if you just bow down to it without touching the cow, then you would not make someone else's cow prohibited. But if you do an act of service, an act of idolatry to the cow itself, involving the cow itself, then the cow would be prohibited even though it doesn't belong to you. And that's how we could explain the first baraita is talking about only bowing down to a cow, someone else's cow is permitted. But pouring oil on someone else's cow's horns, that would make it prohibited. That's Chizkiah. Matkif la'adav ada bar ahava. Hai na'evadhu. Hai bimus ba'almahu v'shariah. Rav Ada bar ahava says, would you call that worshiping the cow? He's not worshiping the cow by doing that. The cow is merely a platform for its horns. And so he's doing an act of worship with his horns that cow is holding. And so therefore, it's just a platform and should be permitted. So we update the answer, and Rav Ada bar ahava said it's actually when someone stole someone else's cow and he poured wine between the horns on the animal itself. It seems that this is a phrase known from Latin, and this was a customary practice to pour wine between the horns. And because it's on the animal itself, da'avad ba ma'aseh, he did an action to the animal, and therefore the animal becomes prohibited, even though it does not belong to him. And here we don't say it's just a platform for the horns because he put it on the animal itself. And when Ula came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he reported a halacha about this. And he says, even though the rabbis taught that if someone bows down to someone else's cow that he doesn't own, then he does not make it prohibited. But if he did an action on the animal itself, like pour wine on the animal's head, then for Avoda Zara, then he does make it prohibited. And so that's what the second baraita is talking about, that case. Amar lehu Rav Nachman, Puku ve'imru le'ola, kevar tirgema Rav Huna lishmatich bebavel. Rav Nachman, when he heard this, that Ula reported this in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, he told his students, go and tell Ula, what, you think you're bringing a chidush from Eretz Yisrael that we didn't know before? We actually know it already, because Rav Huna explained this in Bavel, and he taught this halacha. Damar Rav Huna, hayta behemat chavero rebutza bifnei avoda zara, kevan sheshachat basiman echad asara. Rav Huna gave a different example of an animal that's lying down in front of an idol. If someone comes and slaughters the animal, even if he only cuts one of its pipes, windpipe or the gullet, even if only one, he makes it prohibited. Because even though he doesn't own the animal, he's doing an act on the body of an animal for the sake of idolatry. There's an idol right in front of it. And that makes the animal then prohibited to use. Even if he's doing a kosher shechita, still the animal would not be usable for anything, for a korban. And so we see that Rav Huna says, yes, you can make something prohibited, even though it doesn't belong to you, by doing an act on the animal itself. So that's what Rabbi Yochanan taught. So Rav Nachman says, thank you for your chidush Ula. We already know that here in Bavel from Rav Huna. Now we ask, Mina lan de asraha. How do we know? What's the source that if you do an act even on someone else's animal, it becomes prohibited? Ilema mikohanim v'dilma shane kohanim dibnei de'aninhu. Maybe you'll learn it from kohanim. If a kohen goes and serves idolatry, he becomes disqualified for serving in the Bet HaMikdash. And so maybe that's the same thing, that a cow also that is used for idolatry then can no longer serve. But that's not a good example because Kohanim b'nei de'ah, they have awareness, and the Kohen decided that he's going to go and do idolatry, even if it was under duress, if it's in public. So maybe he should still not do it, even at risk of his life. So you can't compare a Kohen who is making a decision and therefore deserves a penalty that you can no longer serve in the Bet HaMikdash. But the cow, it made no decision. It didn't know what was happening to it. So that's not a good analogy. So maybe we can learn this halacha from the stones of the Mizbeach. The stones of the Mizbeach in the Bet HaMikdash were once used properly. Then the Greeks at the time before the Chashmonaim came in and they defiled them, used them for Avoda Zara. And later on when the Chashmonaim came back, they said, we cannot use these stones. Now the question is, why can't they use them? The idolaters who used them for idolatry, it didn't belong to them. These stones didn't belong to them. And therefore, maybe you'd say they don't have a right to make them defiled. And yet, we see that the Chashmonaim came and said we can't use them. So isn't this a good proof that just like the stones, although they didn't belong to the Greeks, they belonged to Bet HaMikdash, still by using them for idolatry, now they become prohibited to use again for the Bet HaMikdash. So that's a good proof for the cow that if it's served, worships idolatry, if it's used in an idolatrous service, then it becomes prohibited to use in the Bet HaMikdash as a sacrifice. Isn't that a good proof? And we answer no. V'dilma kid Rav Papa. Maybe the explanation of that case is as Rav Papa said a couple of dapim ago. He said that when the Greeks came in and defiled the Mizbeach and made pig offerings to Greek gods, they defiled it and thereby removed its holy status. And when that happened, they acquired it for themselves. So they actually used this Mizbeach for Avodah Zarah, and it was their own, and that's why they were able to defile it, and that's why the Chashmonaim didn't want to use it again. So this is not a proof that one can defile something that doesn't belong to them. During the defiling process, the Mizbeach did belong to the Greeks. Ve'ela mikelim, so let's learn it from vessels that are used for idolatry. They can no longer be used in the Bet HaMikdash. And we know, even though it doesn't belong to the person that's using it for idolatry, it's a temple vessel. Someone used it for Avodah Zarah, that's it. You can't return to the temple. So isn't that a good proof that anything, even a cow, that is used for idolatry cannot be used for a sacrifice anymore? Dichtiv, and we know that vessels that were once used for Avodah Zarah can no longer be used from this pasuk that we have quoted already. King Achaz, an evil king, used temple vessels for Avodah Zarah. And then afterwards, when you had Chizkiah, a righteous king, and he wanted to purify everything, so he had his servants, they came and said, all the vessels that King Achaz cast away and made them defiled, we have prepared and sanctified, and behold, they are before the altar, so we can use them again. A simple reading of this pasuk sounds like they can use them again, but we didn't interpret it in the end that way. They interpreted these two words that they prepared. That means that they actually interred them, they buried them, so as not to use these vessels again. And when it says they sanctified, it wasn't those vessels, but they brought new ones. So we see from here that they did not use those vessels, even though they didn't belong to them. You cannot use them again. That's a good proof that cows also that are used for Avodah Zarah, not just bowed to, but actually used in a service themselves, can no longer be used as a sacrifice. Now you might ask about these vessels. A person cannot make forbidden something that doesn't belong to him, but we see they do become forbidden. So that's a good proof that just like these vessels, so to a cow does become prohibited if used for Avodah Zarah, even if it doesn't belong to the person who is worshipping it. So this is in fact a good proof because they did an action with the vessels themselves. They didn't just bow to the vessels. They used the vessels in idolatrous service. They become prohibited to use in the Bet HaMikdash evermore. So to the cow, if you use the body of the cow itself in an idolatrous service, it becomes prohibited even if it doesn't belong to the idolater. כי אתה רב דימי אמר רבי יוחנן, אף על פי שאמרו משתחווה לקרקע עולם לא 10, חפר בעבורות שיחין ומערות 10. And now, just like Rabbi Yochanan said a law that we just said, even a cow that doesn't belong to you, now we have another similar type of law that Rav Dimi reported when he came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. And he said, even though someone who bows down to the ground does not make it prohibited, it's the ground. You can't make the planet Earth prohibited by bowing down to it. However, if the idolater dug pits, ditches, and caves in it, and bowed down to it, then he made it prohibited because he did something to it. It's similar to the cow. Just bowing down to a cow that's not yours does not make it prohibited. But if you do an act on the cow's body itself, then it does become prohibited. So too, if someone does an act on the land, changes the land, and worships it as Avoda Zara, then that area of land becomes prohibited. Ki ata Rav Shemuel bar Yehuda amar Rabbi Yochanan, afa pi shamru mishtachave leba'alei chayim lo asaran, asan chalipin la'avoda zara asaran. And now another statement in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, this time from Rav Shemuel bar Yehuda. Rabbi Yochanan taught so many things, he had many students, and then they came in from various students, they came to Bavel. And he taught that even though someone who bows down to a live animal will not make it prohibited, if he takes an animal and uses it as an exchange item for an idol, then the animal does become prohibited. In other words, if I have an idol, a prohibited idol, and then I go to some non-Jew and I exchange it. So I'm not allowed to get benefit from it, but if I violate that law, and I say, here's an idol, can I have your cow in exchange? So I take the cow. So even though a cow that's alive, even if I would bow down to the cow, it would not become prohibited. But exchanging it, now I got benefit from this in exchange for an idol, the cow does become prohibited. Ki ata Ravin amar, peligu bar Rabbi Ishmael bar Rabbi Yosef Rabbanan, chad amar chalifin asurin, vechalife chalifin mutarin, vechad amar afilu chalife chalifin nami asurin. Now everybody agrees the cow in that scenario becomes prohibited. The question now is, what if I then take that cow and exchange it for something else, for a sheep? I go to someone else, here, take this cow. The cow is prohibited because of idolatry, because I took it in exchange for an idol. So now I exchange it again for something else, for a sheep. So that is a machloket between Rabbi Ishmael bar Yosef and Rabbanan. Whoever, we don't know which one said which, but one of them said that the first exchange is prohibited, but the exchange of an exchange, that already is permitted, the sheep is permitted. Whereas the other said, even the exchange of an exchange could go on, and all the exchanges will be prohibited. What is the source for the opinion that says that even the exchange of the exchange, the sheep, would be prohibited? Amar kera v'hayita cherem kamohu. Let's look at the full pasuk, because we're going to quote also at the end of it. It says, Lo tavi to'eva el betecha v'hayita cherem kamohu. Do not bring an abhorrent thing into your house, or you will be prescribed like it. So talking about an idol into your house. Shakes teshakesenu, ta'eb teta'abenu, ki cherem hu. Reject it as abominable and abhorrent, because it is prescribed. So look at this word hu. It is prescribed. We're going to see in a second that this is a limiting word. It is prescribed, and that comes to exclude something else. But anyway, right now we're focusing on these words. Vayita cherem kamohu. What does that mean? That you will be prescribed like it. Anything that you cause to become yours because of that idol will have the status as the idol itself. So I owned an idol, that was prohibited. I switched it for a cow, now the cow came into your possession because of the idol, that's prohibited. And it will go on forever. And the cow I switched for a sheep the sheep becomes prohibited also. So that's the reasoning of the stringent opinion. Ve'idach, now the other opinion that says it only is the first exchange, that's it, but then the sheep would be okay. The lenient opinion, what's their source? Amar kira hu velo chalife chalifin. So the lenient source will look to the end of the pasuk where it says that one is a cherem, that meaning the first exchange, the cow, but not the exchange of the exchange, the sheep would be okay. Ve'idach. Now the stringent opinion, what will they do with the word hu? What do you need that for? Hahu miba'ele lemeute orla v'chilei kerem shim mecharan v'kidesh bidmehem mekudeshet. The word hu comes to limit two other cases. Orla, fruit of a tree in the first 3 years, is prohibited not only to eat, but to get benefit from. And also, if you grow various species, diverse species together, kilei kerem, that is also prohibited to even get benefit from it. So now you can't get benefit from these things, which means you can't sell them. What if you violated that law and you sold them, and I got money from it, I got $100 from the sale, and then I give it to a woman, I say, haret mikudeshet li, with this money, and the halacha is the kiddushin works, even though if I would give them that fruit itself, because the fruit I can't get any benefit from, it has no value, and therefore that kiddushin would be null and void. But in this case, if I exchange it for money, then the prohibition does not continue, does not follow the money, but rather it becomes prohibited, it becomes permitted, and the kiddushin is valid. And so the word hahu comes to say that this law of an exchange, that the prohibited status goes even on the cow, on the exchanged item, that only applies to this case of idolatry. It does not apply to other cases. What are the other cases it does not apply to? Orla and kilei hakerem. Ve'idach, and the lenient opinion that says we need the word hahu to say that the prohibition on exchange and idolatry is limited only to the first exchange, but not the second exchange. How will they learn the limitation on orla and kilei hakerem, that if I do sell these two things, that the money that I have, I can get benefit from, and I can do kiddushin with it? How will they learn that law? Because they can't learn it from the word hahu. Orla v'kilei hakerem la tzarich mi'uta. They will say that those two laws do not need a special limitation, because we wouldn't think that the exchange would be prohibited in the first place. Why? Avoda Zara shbi shnei ketubim habim ke'achad v'chol shnei ketubim ke'achad en melamedin. See, if you had only the law of idolatry, that's and it was said, exchanges and idolatry also are prohibited, then that would be a paradigm for all other cases of things that are prohibited to get benefit from, that the exchange also would be prohibited, and therefore I would need hahu to say that these cases, orla and kilei hakerem, are limited. However, this opinion, the lenient opinion, says I don't need to limit those, because avodah zara and shvi'it, things that grow on the shvi'it year, also, I'm not, in a prohibited way, I'm not allowed to get benefit from it, only if it grows by itself and so on. But otherwise, I'm not allowed if I made it grow. So that's prohibited to get benefit from. And so now I have a law regarding avodah zarah and shvi'it. In both cases, it tells me that the exchange, I might exchange for it, is also prohibited. And the rule is, whenever you have two Pesukim that teach the same thing, then we do not use that as a paradigm for everything else, because if the Torah wanted us to say that this law applies to everywhere else, it would just say it in one law, and then I would know to apply it everywhere else. Why would the Torah go out of its way to say the law in two places? It means that that applies only in two places and not anywhere else, and not Olah and Kilei HaKerem. Now we ask, Avodah Zara Hadamaran. Where do we say Avodah Zara, that exchange is prohibited? That's the pasuk that we just said. Shvi'it. Where do we see a law that Shvi'it, produce, that's prohibited? Also the exchange is prohibited. Tichtib ki yobel hi kodesh tiyeh lachem. Ma kodesh tofes et damav ve'asur, af shvi'it tofeset et dameha ve'asura. It says anything that goes in the Yovel year, the laws of the Yovel year are the same as the Shvi'it year. And it says that produce is holy to you. Now, so it's comparing it to holy items, a consecrated item. Well, something that is consecrated as holy, if you exchange it for money, then the holiness and that prohibited status to use it for yourself transfers to the money and it becomes prohibited. So too, if I have Shvi'it produce and I exchange it for money, then the money also will become prohibited. So that's where we see that Shvi'it also has the law of exchange that's prohibited. Now we ask about that. If you're really going to compare it to Kodesh, then compare it fully. And if I have a Kodesh item, I say this table is Kodesh, and then I want to exchange it for money, so then the holiness goes to the money, and the table is chulin, and I can use the table for anything. So too, you might think that something that grows during that I make grow during Shavuot and is prohibited, and then I exchange it for money, so maybe now the produce will be permitted and I can just eat it, no problem. But that's not true. Talmud Omar tihiyeh b'havayata teheh. The pasuk says here ki yovel hi kodesh tihiyeh lachem. That word tihiyeh comes to add that the Shavuot prohibition will remain as is, even if you exchange it for money or sell it or exchange it for something else. The prohibited status will remain on the produce and will also go to the next item that you use to exchange it. Hakesad, how will this work? What if you go many steps? Lakach beperot shavi'it basar. So let's say I had a fruit that grew in a prohibited way in the Shavuot year, and I exchange it for meat. Elu ve'elu meat ba'arin b'Shavuot. So then the produce and also the meat, I have to eradicate. I'm not allowed to keep it. I have to put it out for anyone to come and take it. They're both prohibited. Lakach basar dagim. But what if I take that meat and I exchange it for fish? Yasa basar nichnasu dagim. Then the meat is permitted, and the prohibition is only on the fish. Dagim yain. We're going to go for a few more steps. I exchange the fish for wine. Yasu dagim nichnas yain. Then the fish becomes permitted, and the wine gets prohibited. B'yain shemen yasa yain v'nichnas shemen. If I exchange the wine for oil, then the wine becomes permitted and the oil becomes prohibited. Hakesad. So how does it work? What's the principle? Acharon nitpas b'shavuot ufri atzmo asur. It's the last item in the chain. That is what takes the prohibition, like Shavuot, and also the original produce is prohibited. We don't say that everything along the line becomes prohibited, but rather the original produce, that's for sure prohibited forever. There's no way to undo that. And then the fact that I exchange it for something else, only one item of exchange, the last one that I own, will become prohibited. And so now we know that these two laws, Avoda Zara and Shavuot, because these are two Pesukim that come together. And so then I would know that the law of prohibited exchange applies only to them and not to anything else that has a prohibition of benefit. And therefore, I don't need any extra word to tell me that Orla and Kilei Kerem, something that I exchanged them for, would be permitted. Ve'idach. Now, how will the other opinion deal with this? Don't we have two ketuvim? So you shouldn't need the word hahu to teach me that we're excluding ola and kilei kerem. That opinion will say, go against this general methodology and say that even when there are two Pesukim that teach the same thing, still that can be used as a paradigm. For some reason, the Torah wants to say it twice, but even those two can be a paradigm for everything else, and therefore, based on that paradigm, I would have thought that Ola and Kilei Kerem also have a prohibition on things that I exchange for them. And that's why, according to that opinion, we need the word hu to come and say, no, it applies to Avodah Zarah, but not Orla and Kilei HaKerem. Next Mishnah. Shalu et hazikenim beromi. Some non-Jews once asked the rabbinic elders in Rome, Im en resono ba'avodah zarah, lama eno mebatela. If Hashem does not want avodah zarah, why doesn't he destroy it? How come every time someone builds an idol or a temple, shrine to idolatry, why doesn't Hashem just send lightning and earthquake and destroy it? Why would he let it stay around? See, it must be that idolatry is okay. אמרו להן, אילו לדבר שאין לצורך לעולם בו היו עובדין, היה מבטלו. הרי הן עובדין לחמה, וללבנה, ולכוכבים, ולמזלות, יאבד עולם מפני השוטים. And so the wise rabbis, the elders, answered and said, if the idolaters only bow down to things that the world doesn't need, then indeed God would have destroyed it. If they only bow down to pieces of metal, some wooden things, then the world doesn't need them. Hashem would indeed have destroyed them. But look, the idolaters, they bow down to the sun, the moon, the stars, the constellations. So everything they bow down to, Hashem's going to destroy. He's going to have to destroy the sun, destroy the moon, destroy everything. So there's no end. Therefore, Hashem does not destroy all the things that people serve as idolatry. Amru lahen, but the idolaters came back and said, If so, how come Hashem doesn't destroy things that the world does not need, that are worshipped, like a piece of wood, but leave the sun and the moon because the world needs it? So Hashem should at least destroy those things that he can destroy, that are worshipped as idolatry, to show that they're no good. אמרו להן, אף אנו מחזיקין ידי עובדיהן של אלו, שאומרים תדעו שהן אלוהות, שהרי הן לא בטלו. And the rabbis answer, no, if Hashem would do that, then he would be giving support to those who worship the sun and the moon, because they'll say, look, the sun and the moon must be really God's, because when we go and worship some piece of gold or some piece of wood, they get destroyed immediately, they incinerate. So you see, those are fake because they can't protect themselves. But when we worship the sun and the moon, then they stay. Must be the sun and the moon are true. And so that would be a false conclusion. And therefore, Hashem does not destroy any idolatry. He can't destroy all of it because he'll have to destroy the whole world. So he destroys none of it, so that no one will be able to get a false conclusion that, oh, this thing got destroyed, oh, so that's a bad idol. But the other thing didn't get destroyed, that means it's a true God. So therefore, better to destroy nothing. That's the Mishnah. We're going to see a couple of other versions of similar conversations. Tenor Banan, first in the Baraita. Shalu filosofin et hazekenim beromi. Very similar here. It's a philosopher that asked the elders, the rabbis in Rome, if your God does not like Avoda Zara, why doesn't he destroy it? And the answer the same thing that we just said. That if they only worship things that the world doesn't need, yes, God would have destroyed them. But they bow down to the sun and the moon and the stars and the constellations. Should Hashem destroy the world because of stupid people? Rather, important principle, the world follows its natural course. And just because someone worships something, although Hashem hates it and it's abominable and all that, still he lets the world follow its natural course, and that idol might stay there for many years, a long time. But those stupid people who are bowing down to these things that are nothing, they will get their judgment in the future. So they'll get their punishment. Hashem is not going to act immediately and incinerate the idol. So he leaves it there. And eventually, don't worry, the idol worshiper will get their punishment. Davar acher, another interpretation. Hare shegazal se'ah shel chitin ve'halach uzra'a bakarka dinu shelo tismach ela olam ki minhago noheg veholech ve'shotim shekilkilu atidin liten et hadin. It's not a different interpretation. This is another application of the very same principle. If someone steals a se'ah of wheat and he goes and plants it in the ground, this is stolen goods. So really, it should not be successful, and that stolen wheat that he planted, Hashem should not allow it to grow as a punishment. And then people will know, oh, because it's stolen, so then they won't steal again. How come Hashem doesn't micromanage in that way? No, he doesn't do that. Rather, the world follows its natural course, and even a thief, yes, temporarily, he can benefit from the thing that he stole, and it will grow a lot, and maybe temporarily he'll get rich from that. But that foolish person who sinned, he will end up getting judgment in the future. At some point, he'll get his judgment, even though not immediately. That's how Hashem runs the world. And another application, if someone has relations with his friend's wife, adultery, sin. Now, really, it would be proper that it should not lead to a pregnancy. This person sinned with this woman, so they should not have the benefit of having a child. It should not result in a child. But Hashem doesn't do that. Instead, he lets the world follow its natural course, and they may have a child. And this man who committed adultery, he will get his punishment eventually. It won't be necessarily apparent right away. והיינו דאמר יש לקיש, אמר הקדוש ברוך הוא, לא דיין לרשעים שעושים סלע שלי פומבי, אלא שמצריכין אותי ומחתימין אותי בעל כורחי. Quite an amazing statement by Resh Lakish, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, it's not enough that these evil people who commit adultery, they make my stamp, for my coin stamp, public. A coin stamp, that's the mold that the king would use to mint stamps. So this is a very precious item. He keeps it in private, like the mint. You can't just go into a mint and take a $100 printing machine. And so the analogy is just like a king prints and puts his face on each of the coins, but he controls that stamp. So too, every human being is created b'tselem Elokim. In a way, human beings are God's coins, because we have, as if, the face of God, the Tselem Elokim, the stamp of God is upon each person. So when a couple has a proper marriage and have a child, what a beautiful thing. The man, the woman come, the third partner is Hashem. Hashem says, I'm happy to put my stamp on this baby that this nice couple has. So then Hashem is happy to do it. But now, look what happens. These evil people commit adultery, and now they cause my Tselem Elokim to be used in an improper way. It's a counterfeit. And not only do they do that, but they force me to come and put my stamp of approval upon it, because Hashem is needed in order to create that baby. And now, against my will, because of their sin, because nature takes its course, and so Hashem's not going to stop every illegal marriage from having children, so then Hashem has to go out of his way and give his stamp on this illegal child. And so Hashem is extra upset that he's forced into, in fact, participating in something that is a sin. שאל פילוסופוס אחד את רבן גמליאל, כתוב בתורתכם, כי אדוני אלוהיך אש אוכלה הוא אל קנה, מפני מה מתקנא בעובדיה ואין מתקנא בה. A certain philosopher asked Rabban Gamliel. It's interesting that it's a philosopher here and not simply a goy or an idolater. You see, the philosophers in Roman times and Greek times, they themselves did not believe in the pagan gods, like Plato and Aristotle and their students that came after them. They actually believed more or less in one God, one power in the world. And therefore, this philosopher is asking Rabban Gamliel about says in his Torah. The philosopher knows Torah, can quote a pasuk and even the interpretation of the pasuk, which is actually possible because already Christianity was widespread, and so people knew about pasukim in the Torah, and we even have debates between Christians and philosophers where they are quoting verses. So this definitely is possible that the philosopher is challenging Rabban Gamliel from a pasuk, and the pasuk says that Hashem, your God, is a devouring fire, a jealous God. God is jealous of idols. So he's like, the philosopher is saying, well, we don't believe in all these idols. Why would Hashem be jealous of something that does not exist? The question is actually clearer in a different version, which is an earlier version of this conversation, which is found in the Mechilta, where the philosopher says, but does an idol have the power to provoke jealousy? A brave man is jealous of a brave man, a wise man of a wise man, a rich man of a rich man. But does an idol have the power to provoke jealousy? Why would Hashem be jealous of something that is nothing? Over here, the question is a bit different. Why is Hashem jealous only of the worshippers of Bnei Israel, if they would worship idolatry, and not of the idol itself? Amar lo, Rabban Gamliel answers, Emshol lecha mashal, lema hadavar domeh, lemelech basav adam shaya lo ben echad, ואותו הבן היה מגדל לו את הכלב, ועלה לו שם על שם אביו. וכשהוא נשבע אומר, בחיי כלב אבא. כששמע המלך, על מי הוא כועס? על הבן הוא כועס או על האב הוא כועס? הווה אומר, על הבן הוא כועס. Rabban Gamliel says, I'll give you a parable to a king, a human king who has a son. And that son had a dog that he was raising. And he called the dog the same name as his father. His father's name was King George. He names he names the dog George. And whenever the son would vow, normally one would vow to something that is important to them. One vows to a god, or one vows by the life of his father. But instead, he would say, by the life of my dog George, calling the same name. Now, when the king hears that, who is he going to be angry at? Is he going to be angry at the son or at the dog? Okay, he's not going to be angry at the dog. The dog just sat there, didn't do anything. Rather, it's going to be on the son, who's giving importance to the dog and demeaning his own father by calling the dog the same name as his father and then swearing in the name of the dog. So too, Hashem is not jealous of idols, but rather, because idols are nonsense, they're nothing to be jealous of, but rather only is jealous or angry at the worshippers, Bnei Israel, who are abandoning Hashem and worshipping those idols. This is a curious mashal. Like, why pick a dog or something like that? You could have picked a man who's jealous of his wife, even though his wife is cheating on him with some nonsense, with like nothing, something imaginary. So you could imagine a mashal like that. So what's the deal with the dog and swearing with the dog? And this article that by Professor Azan Yadin argues that this dog actually was something well known. There is a dialogue between a Greek philosopher and an Egyptian priest. And within that dialogue, they quote the fact that Socrates, who didn't believe in the pagan gods, would swear by a dog. And so the point is that here Rabban Gamliel would be challenging this philosopher in the philosopher's own background, saying even your teacher, Socrates, would swear in the name of a dog, not because he believed that the dog has power, but rather because he wanted to demean the gods and didn't want to swear in the name of the gods, and therefore swore in the name of a dog instead. And so, just like the philosopher would agree that Socrates would swear by something else instead of God, so not because they believes in the gods, but rather to demean them. So too, the pasuk says Hashem is jealous. He is jealous not of the God, but rather of his sons of Bnei Israel, who would worship a god instead of Hashem. And so this has a cultural meaning that would have been known back at that time. Amar lo, Keleb ata kore ota v'halo yesh ba mamash. Now, the philosopher, or in this case, maybe it switches to an idolater. The idolater says, you're calling the idol a dog? But it has efficacy. The idol is real. It has power. Amalo maraita. Rabban Gamliel says, why do you think that an idol has power? Amalo pamachat nafla deleka be'irenu v'nisrefa kol ha'ir kula v'oto bet avoda zara lo nisraf. And the idolater says, one time there was a fire in our town, and everything in the town got burned down except for the temple of idol worship. It was not burned. So you see, the idol has power. It protected its temple. Amar lo emshol lecha mashal lema davar domeh lemelech basav adam shesarcha alav medina כשהוא עושה מלחמה עם החיים הוא עושה או עם המתים הוא עושה. הווה אומר עם החיים הוא עושה. Rabban Gamliel says, I'll answer you with the parable. What is this like? To a human king where there was a province that rebelled against him. Now he's going to go and destroy the province. When he goes and fights, who does he fight with? Those who are alive or those who are dead? Certainly, he fights with those who are alive. In other words, he's going to come into a city that he wants to destroy. He's going to go fight with the live soldiers. He's not going to go to the cemetery and fight with dead people. There's no point in that. So too, when Hashem sends a punishment to a city, like a fire in the city, whatever sin they were doing, Hashem destroyed the city. He only wanted to destroy the things that are alive, the people that were doing those sins in the city. And so therefore they were burnt and their homes were burnt. But the idol has no power, no life, it's nothing. So there's no point in burning down the temple of idolatry precisely because it's so insignificant, it's already dead. Amar lo, Keleb ata koreh ota met ata koreh ota, im ken yabedena min ha'olam. And then the idolater says to Rabban Gamliel, you're calling idols a dog, you're calling them like they're already dead. If so, if Hashem doesn't thinks it's so bad, why doesn't He destroy idols from the world? Amar lo ilu davar she'en ha'olam sarich lo hayu ovdin, hareh hu mebatela, hareh hen ovdin lechama v'lebanal kochav mazalot afikim v'lageot, yaved olamo mipnei shotim. And now, similar answer that we said before, but this one's actually a little bit expanded. It says, if the idolaters would only worship things that the world doesn't need, then yes, Hashem would destroy those things. But they are worshiping the sun and the moon and the stars and the constellations and the streams and the valleys. So He should destroy the whole world because of these foolish people. V'chenu omer, asof asef kol, me'al penei adama ne'um Adonai, asef adam ubehema, asef of hashamayim, udgeh hayam, ve'hamachshelot et hareshaim ve'gomer. There's a pasuk in Sefaniah that says, if Hashem were to destroy idolatry, then He would have to go and destroy everything from the face of the earth. Shall I consume man and beast, fowl, heaven of the heavens, fish of the sea, stumbling blocks of the wicked? Pasuk continues and says, shall I cut off man from the face of the earth? Hashem says, well, am I going to destroy the whole earth in order to get rid of idolatry? He doesn't want to destroy his whole earth. Just because the wicked people stumble and they worship these things, should I destroy the whole world? There's good people in the world too. Why should they have to suffer? After all, the idolaters even worship other human beings. So then he'll have to destroy humanity from the face of the earth. Therefore, Hashem is not going to do that, and therefore that's why He does not destroy idolatry from the earth. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.